There's a very, very big thing, a very big defining factor of capitalism that basically changed or disappeared in the 70s, which really changes everything, right? That really changes everything. I mean, you know how people always talk about how communism is like a classless, moneyless, etc. society, right? Well, I mean, there was an event that happened in the 70s, which in many ways brought true a lot of those predictions about communism. But I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm still going to wait until I get some more people in here. Now, I will make clear a few things. There are things we don't understand about the way in which the what I call this new socialist mode of production works. There's even things I don't understand about it, right? There's a lot of mysteries here. There's a lot of paradoxes even with the new mode of production, the way in which it functions, right? So there is a lot of space for debate and also for improvement upon the insights. But before we can even get to that point, before we can even get to the point of actually having, I think, would be a thoughtful debate about this, right? About what the implications of the things I'm going to mention later on are, you have to actually accept the fact that these things are significant. You have to accept the fact that World War I was significant. You have to accept the fact that the Great Depression was significant. You have to accept the fact that World War II was significant. You have to accept the fact that the Cold War was significant. And this is the really big one, the really big one. You have to accept the fact that the end of the gold standard was significant. And also, Bretton Woods. You have to, before you can even have a thoughtful conversation about this, there's certain changes in history that occurred after, the kind of classical era of imperialism that you have to take into account. If you're not even taking into account these transformations and you're saying, oh, it's literally all just the same, it's all the same, nothing significant has changed, well, then you're not even at the starting point, right? It's not to give a definitive position about the nature of today's mode of production, because there are a lot of mysteries there, but it's to at least allow everyone to reach the same starting point, right? We have to reach at least the same starting point about the nature of today's mode of production. We cannot have this outdated view where we ignore World War I, we ignore the Great Depression, we ignore Bretton Woods, we ignore the end of the gold standard and so on. We ignore all these things and just conveniently say that our theories must remain exactly the same. You cannot make an essential dogma out of Marxism. Marxism is dialectical materialism. As the mode of production changes and revolutionizes so much your understanding of it, you have to also revolutionize the way you're thinking about it, right? You have to have new insights into it. This is why Lenin had the theory of imperialism to begin with, right? Because there was a development within the capitalist mode of production to a higher stage. All I'm insisting is that over the course of the 100 years since Lenin wrote Imperialism, there has been other developments in the advancement of the mode of production, which are very significant and can't be ignored. Now that we have a decent amount of people in here, I'm actually going to get into kind of the actual content. First, I'm going to start with Hudson's theory of super imperialism, right? So Hudson pretty much starts his analysis starting from World War I. He takes a lot of the premises that Lenin laid down in his analysis of imperialism, which for Hudson, which to me I think applies prior to the end of before the end of World War I, right? He takes all those premises and he kind of starts from World War I itself. And what he kind of makes significant about World War I here is that during World War I, America was a kind of associate to its allies, right? And so it basically gave its allies these loans, but instead of acting like an ally and giving its allies a kind of easy way to pay off its loans or forgiving a lot of its loans, it actually was kind of like a pragmatic business partner about this. And so after the end of World War I, we have a situation where what used to be the more advanced imperialist countries in Europe, like Britain and France, were now indebted to America, and America had become the new world's premier creditor, right? The premier creditor of the world, because it had loaned all this money off to the Allies during World War I, right? So you have this situation where it's like the Allies owe money to America, Germany owes money to the Allies, etc. And this is the kind of financial situation you have after World War I. Now, America didn't play by the typical rules of a creditor, by the typical European and British rules of being a creditor, which would normally allow these countries in some way or another to be able to pay off their debt. And so this became a kind of crisis. Well, there are many different results of this. There were eras between World War I and World War II in which protectionism was the kind of status quo. And then there was also an attempt by some to basically, and this is what led to the Great Depression, to kind of create a new, not a new financial system per se, but a way of addressing these loans. And so what basically happened was that these countries, especially America, and this is another distinction Hudson points out between the earlier stage of imperialism, they would closely monitor their country's investments, and private investments were more and more replaced by governmental investments. Now, eventually, private finance capital investments returned, but when they returned, they were under the close regulation of the government, and they followed, in Hudson's own words, diplomatic ends, right? They were subjugated to the diplomacy of the state, right? And so you have a situation in which there's a kind of rise of state power and sovereignty where financial realities are now becoming subjected to the state. Prior to this, there was planning of financial investments between imperialists, but it was never directly through the state. It was always implicit, right? It was always through a kind of corruption where these same imperialists were on the boards of monopolies, they were in the banks, and they were in the state, right? But in this case, you actually have the state in its own sovereign capacity regulating the export of finance capital according to diplomatic lines. And the situation that emerged was a kind of a triangular circuit where I believe it was America would loan money to Germany. Germany would then use that money to pay off the allies like Britain and France and so on. And then the allies would use that money to pay off America. But this is obviously a kind of bubble that was being created, right? And so with the Great Depression, this bubble basically pops. And this is, I think, one of the most significant crises of capitalism is the Great Depression. And it's actually in response to the Great Depression that all these new forms of state planning arise. Like, for example, in America, you have the rise of FDR. And FDR abandoned the kind of European focus on international financial relations and focused more so on the domestic economy. And he did this by a kind of more explicit planning of the domestic economy. You had, for example, the government became the biggest employer in the country. You have all these new social programs. You have all these new regulations and so on. And he does all this to address the social crisis of the Great Depression. In Germany and Italy, you have the rise of fascism, right, of National Socialism as a way of addressing this social crisis. And then in Britain was one of the countries in which they maintained a kind of desire to maintain the old ways when it comes to finance and credit. And so they kind of lagged behind. But generally speaking, you had a turn towards all these different kinds of socialism as a way of addressing the Great Depression. Now, Hudson doesn't really get into the question of whether or not these were turns towards socialism, because he doesn't really address socialism that much. But I do think that's a direct implication. Now, going beyond that, obviously World War II happens next, right? With World War II, you have a situation that is, again, kind of similar to World War I, where America is basically making all these loans to its allies, and in this way, rising to a kind of position of superiority over the European powers. But this was done in a different way, right? This was done via the land lease. And there were more, I guess you could say, it was more calculated as to how this would be paid back and so on. After the Great Depression, different from the way that America addressed its position as the world creditor, not after the Great Depression, after World War II, different from the way in which America addressed its position as the world creditor after World War I, America this time took a very different route. They blamed the Great Depression in World War II upon the kind of hard and pragmatic and cold approach towards collecting their credits. And instead, they designed a new world system, which would, one, address the rebuilding of these economies and infrastructure after the war, would also address the kind of financial situation, and also was meant to address employment, right, to ensure that America maintained full employment. And so Bretton Woods, with the help of the English, was designed. And so you have what Hudson called the special Anglo-American relationship in these Bretton Woods institutions. America would be the biggest stakeholder in each of these institutions, and they would be partnered with Britain, basically. And as a bloc working together, no other country in these institutions could actually compete with their agenda, as so long as they basically voted and worked together. There's a bit of an internal struggle here between whether or not these institutions would be more political or more financial. And in a sense, you can say finance won out. But here's the thing. As Hudson points out, this new free trade paradigm based on the Bretton Woods institutions is not just like free competitive trade. It takes implicit to this the special Anglo-American relationship and control over these financial institutions, such that these institutions were used to basically plan the world economy. So, for example, one example that I already gave was America's desire to maintain full employment, right? So they would regulate trade in such a way that certain of their agricultural exports would be privileged, and stuff like this, basically. Also, another thing that Hudson points out is the way in which they basically crippled third world economies and forced these economies to go along to their agenda. So if these economies wanted to receive IMF loans, they had to follow specific developmental models that were forced upon them, right? So in order to get these loans, they had to follow these flawed and developmental models. Industrialization always comes from agricultural surpluses. And so you have a very, very catastrophic development of industry here, where the industry is apart from the agriculture. And the agriculture is actually kept specifically slowed down and retarded it's basically kept in a very weakened state. And this is because, for example, America wanted to make sure that its agricultural exports remained dominant. This was part of the reason why. And so you have this situation where these global financial institutions are literally planning the world economy. Now, there's a sore thumb here, which is that the USSR doesn't actually become a part of this new Bretton Woods system. And Hudson thinks that this is the case because America and Britain didn't actually want them to become a part of it. So they gave them an unfair deal, a bad deal, a deal that they basically predicted that they would refuse, precisely so that they could exclude the USSR from Bretton Woods. That's his own theory of kind of how it worked. And so you have the Cold War that starts. Now, what's important here is that during the Cold War, American military expenditures increased dramatically, right, as a way of fighting back communism. This reaches a boiling point when you get to the Vietnam War, because at the Vietnam War, America was in a situation such that if it continued this war, right, it would basically economically cripple itself. And it had lost the position of being the world's creditor and now was actually in debt, right? America was actually in debt. And this presented a kind of crisis to America because America had been the world creditor up until now. But conveniently, by this point, countries had so many dollars in reserve by this point. So the dollar had risen to a kind of special status. And because of the rise of the dollar, while America was accumulating all this debt, instead of having to oppose austerity and having to basically force its citizens to take back the loans, reclaim the finance capital that they were exporting and so on, instead of this having to be the case, America simply changed the rules, basically, right? They got rid of the gold standard. And with the end of the gold standard and the rise of the dollar as the global reserve currency, this created a situation where countries were obliged to give America more loans, right? Because if the dollar crashes and the dollar is your reserve currency, this is a crisis also for you. So countries are now all basically forced with the threat of a crisis of giving America endless loans, right? Endless loans, basically. It's practically endless in comparison to what the status quo was before. Now, to give you an example, when Britain tried to do something similar in the past, going off of the gold standard in order to finance war, I mean, this basically was the beginning of the end of the British Empire and why it fell into, why it ceased to be this, major creditor, right? But in the case of America, becoming a debtor actually benefited it because now you had this new situation based upon the supremacy of the dollar that America can borrow endless money. It can devote that money to war. With the war, it can maintain political control, right? And so you have this circuit where America has to borrow money to finance war. War must be financed in order to basically beat the USSR and win the Cold War and maintain its rising American empire. And this circuit basically continues until where we're at now. I mean, Hudson even points at the fact that I believe there are like 5 years in which foreign economies finance the entirety of the American increase in debt, right? So you have America just taking billions and billions and billions of dollars in debt. So this is what I meant, by the way, when I said that the financial basis of imperialism now is no longer the export of finance capital, but is instead debt and the supremacy of the dollar. Now, some people say to this, okay, well, isn't debt a kind of finance capital? So the way I address this is three things. The first thing I want to say is that even if debt is finance capital, this is unique from classical imperialism because America is not based upon the export of finance capital. In this case, it would be based upon the import of finance capital, right? So this would be the exact opposite of what defined the imperialist countries that Lenin was talking about in his day. Secondly, it's only capital insofar as it's taken on to produce a profit. Now, some of the debt that America takes on does go to profitable enterprises. Some of it goes to domestic social planning. A lot of it goes to war. And war in general is not profitable. There may be some people who profit off of war, right? The military-industrial complex, but the government itself is not like taking on this debt and then producing a commodity and getting more from the production of this commodity than the debt that it originally took on, right? America is not actually generating a net profit from the taking on of this debt. So in this sense, no, debt actually is not necessarily capital here. And the third thing I want to get at, and this is kind of the more controversial point, is that can we even really speak of capital in such an unqualified way after the end of the gold standard? Now, this is where I'm going to actually kind of go away from just Hudson's analysis and give my own point of view. If you read, Capital, you would know that basically the first few chapters are about value, right? It's about how is value generated. Marx talks about basically how there's abstract human labor and commodities which have abstract human labor. They can be exchanged for other commodities, et cetera, so on. And he developed this analysis in the form of the commodity all the way up to the money form, which is the actual form of value. The completed value form is the money form, right? And so basically what he makes clear is that commodity money is the value form, right? Another thing he makes clear is this. While commodity money does not give rise to value, it only gives rise to the value form. The value form is necessarily implied by value, right? And so in other words, even though commodity money is not value itself, it's only the value form, right? Even though it's not the thing that generates value itself, it only generates the value form. It is only through the value form that we can know there is value. And I'll take it even a step further. Marx also says that value necessarily gives rise to the value form. In other words, insofar as there is value, it will always give rise to its form. And this is why you have to apply dialectics, right? Because Marx is basically talking about the dialectic of content and form here. Insofar as there is content, that content has a form. And so while the form is distinct from the content, while the value form is distinct from value itself, you cannot say that there is value when there is no value form. And so taking this into account, what actually happens when the gold standard ends, right? We have basically the end of commodity money. Before this, even though you had paper money, that paper money was backed up by gold, right? Gold was still the commodity at the end of the day. You still had commodity money. After the end of the gold standard, you have the end of commodity money, right? You have the end of the value form. I mean, this is extremely significant, right? But they tell you that, nothing has changed since Lenin's time and we don't need any new analysis. But I mean, the value form itself has either collapsed or changed so drastically that it's outside of the kind of realm of Marx and classical economics now. And this is not something significant. This is not something major. This is not something we actually have to think about. Now, maybe you can have arguments about whether or not value still exists, about whether or not we're in socialism, we're still in capitalism, et cetera. You can have arguments about that, but you have to at least take as your premise all the things that I just mentioned beforehand and their significance. If you don't take that as the premise of your analysis, and if you don't realize that this requires a new analysis, that you actually have to think in a way that's relevant to the new times we're in, well, then you're literally 100 years behind. Marxism was never about just essentializing and making dogmas out of Marx's writings. Marxism is about a scientific investigation into political economy, into the mode of production, right? And so if the value form is ended and you don't have a scientific analysis of this, you're not even at the point where you can be wrong. You're literally just 100 years behind. If you want to criticize me and say I'm wrong, you have to at least have some counter theory as to what actually happened with the end of the gold standard. And they don't have one because they act like it's not even that important, right? It's just export of finance capital. We don't even know if capital still even exists, right? We have to reestablish whether or not capital exists and in what form does it exist and what the value form is. There's a lot of different ways you can go from this here. One way you could go is you could say that, okay, there's no longer value, right? Because kind of the Marxist notion of value is broken down. And you can say that. Now, that's the direction that Jehu takes. He basically says that now money it has no value, right? Money literally has no value now is what he takes. And so all commodities are equalized through zero value is the direction that Jehu takes. And I'm not sure if this is entirely correct, but I think it has a lot of truth to it. I think it at least has a lot of truth to it. Another direction you could take from this is you can say that, okay, maybe value in the Marxist sense has collapsed, but there's some kind of vestige of value, right, that still carries on after the collapse of commodity money. And I'm very sympathetic to this view, that there may be like a vestige of value or some leftover of value that still persists. That makes sense to me. So that's another direction you can take it. Also, you can just take it even in a more, extreme direction. You can just say, yes, value really has ceased to exist. And now we're in the birth pangs of a new mode of production. It's just that the superstructure hasn't caught up to it yet, right? That the relations of production and the political superstructure and the culture and so on, and in the way in which people actually live their lives has not actually caught up to this transformation in the mode of production, right? These things do work like that sometimes, right? Now, my position that we already live in socialism, I think it's extremely well supported, right? So even going back to the Great Depression, right? You have the turn towards state planning that I mentioned, right? The turn towards state planning to address the great social crisis, right? You literally have, the rise of FDR, you have the rise of National Socialism, et cetera, so on. And then also in the USSR, you have explicit, direct, Marxist, socialism, whatever. Then after this, with the Bretton Woods institutions, okay, you can say, they decentralized again. But this decentralization actually was allowed for even greater planning that was global now in scale, right? And so you have an advancement of this new socialist mode of production. And then the kicker, I think, is the end of the gold standard, right? The end of commodity money, the sublation of the value form, right? These things are all characteristic of the socialist mode of production, right? Now we have a situation in which the economy is politicized, right? The economy is no longer led by MCM prime. The economy is led by social ends. This may be environmentalism. This may be poverty reduction. This may be a large host of things, right? And in America, you can say, for example, that these ends have a bourgeois content, right? While in China, they have a proletarian content, right? You can make that kind of distinction, but there's still a explicit social planning. I mean, they literally, meet up and they plan the world economy in the way in which they want the world economy to develop. Secondly, you have the collapse of value, right? And a value collapses. I don't know how much you know about Marxism, but according to Marx, this is the kind of the center of everything. If there's no value form, there's no value. If there's no value, there's no commodities proper. If there's no value and no commodities proper, you can't really say there's classes anymore, et cetera. So you kind of get down the rabbit hole of all these implications that stem from the collapse of value. Now, I do think that classes still exist. And, also if you read, Marx, Lenin, et cetera, you'll see that classes do persist into socialism. I think that classes do still exist, but I think we can't take for granted what the actual basis of class is. There's a very strong chance that today class has become extremely politicized, corresponding to the politicization of the economy itself. So I think that my position that we already live in socialism, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's probably the most consistent take on all these developments that I mentioned. You just don't really have the capitalist mode of production anymore. What makes this seem so crazy is because obviously we still have a bourgeois ruling elite. But I think in this case, you mistake the superstructure for the base, right? You mistake the revolution in the mode of production for the revolution in politics, right? And so my theory is that we still need a proletarian revolution in Western countries, right? And only when there is a proletarian revolution can this new mode of production be unfettered and socialism can actually be unleashed, right? It's just like how you had the beginning stages of industry and capitalism developing before the overthrow of monarchies, but the overthrow of monarchies be unfettered, right? I think something similar is going on with socialism. We have the kind of germ of socialism that has developed, and it simply in the West needs to be unfettered by a political revolution, by the dictatorship of the proletariat. In China, I argue, you have not only a socialist mode of production, but you also have a socialist superstructure, right? Because you have the Communist Party of China, which acts as the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And is the source of power behind the People's Republic. So that's basically my position. And I think it's a lot more well thought out than people who criticize me and attack me have given me credit for. And like I said, these people who criticize me don't even come from the standpoint of taking as a premise all the history I mentioned. They literally just go back 100 years. So if you are going to have a debate with me about this or criticism with me about this, you have to at least be aware of the history. And that's what gets me so much is like these people think they're making a thoughtful criticism. They're literally ignoring like 100 years of history. And to anyone who's actually familiar with the development of imperialism since World War I, just would realize this is absolutely absurd and stupid. This is absolutely stupid. So anyways, if there's anyone who wants to debate me about this position I have, I'm here. We can have a respectful debate about it, and you can come up. Is there anyone? Okay, someone has requested speakership. Hello.
Oh, nice to talk to you, Henry. I've been following for like a year now. Something I've tweeted about this before. Marx talks about in like the first volume, he says mythologies are commodities and commodities are mythologies.
Yeah, like the fetishism of the commodity.
Yeah, it's like it makes it forget where it comes from in the first place in its own edifice. But I'd say like with the earlier you were talking about the value, I'd say like maybe the value of like the value form is like this brand, like the brand of a company.
Well, yes, in a sense. So here's why I have my position on value and the value form, right? So the value form is not the content of value. It's not value itself. It's only the form that value takes, right? But because I'm a dialectical materialist, I don't think that you can simply separate form from its own content, right? I think that content always has forms, and form is always the form of content. And so for me, if the form breaks down, this also is the breakdown of the content because the content would necessarily give rise to form. Marx also basically says this too when he says, let me find the quote actually. Give me one second. I'm going to find the quote and if I can let you know what I'm referencing. Let's see.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, okay. So Marx says money as a measure of value is the phenomenal form that must of necessity be assumed by that measure of value, which is immanent in commodities, labor time. And so if you want to make the argument, for example, that there's still value because there's still abstract labor, well, I don't think that's the case because abstract labor, according to Marx, would necessarily give rise to money, right? To the measure of value, right? To the value form. And so that's why I think these things are kind of intrinsically linked, right? We're not talking about something that is distinct from value. We're talking about the content of value versus the form of value. It would be like suggesting, for example, that even though a chair has like fallen apart, there's still some kind of hidden content that is unseen that exists. It's an idealist error, right? So that's basically where I'm getting at when it comes to this dialectic of form and content. Yeah, and when you mentioned the kind of illusory nature of commodities, yeah, that is the case. I mean, Marx says that, commodities mask their relationship as a relationship between things when in reality they're a relationship of man to man. So there is a kind of illusion here. And actually there's a really good podcast that discusses the kind of illusory nature of political economy that I tweeted out recently. It's very interesting. And I don't know if it necessarily has like a central thesis, kind of explores a lot of stuff. But that's one of the things that they kind of investigate is the illusory nature of political economy.
Yeah, I love Kanbot and all that stuff. With even the etymology of the word project, just meaning something that just takes over. It's something that takes us over. In Kanbot's Sudcast thing that you posted a couple days ago, of just like the etymology of the word project literally means like something that is unmanageable. Right,
yeah. I love the way they get into like kind of the history of words and how they develop. They have like an encyclopedic knowledge of these kinds of things. It's really amazing. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, here's what I think the implications of this kind of we already live in socialism is. The implication to me is that objectively the socialist mode of production has prevailed as Marx, Engels, and Lenin predicted. But now we have a competition of communism versus socialism, right? Zizek, in an ironic way, because he's always right in the wrong ways, wrong in the right ways, says that in the future there will be communism versus socialism, right? There will be an internal fight within socialism, where socialism can be kind of taken for granted. I think we have a situation kind of like that. In the West, while there's a socialist mode of production and there's a politicization of the economy, they take this politicization too far and in a very one-sided way. They act like utopian socialists, right? They have their own abstractions about how reality should be. And because now the economy is politicized, they try to force those ideas on reality, right? And they take this state planning in too far of a one-sided direction, which is too much divorced from its very material premises. China, on the other hand, right, its planning of the economy is already reconciled with the advancement in the revolutions in the forces of production. It's already reconciled with the material premises of the political superstructure. Because as communists, like Engels says, we recognize that freedom is insight into necessity. And so state planning is not just the ability to do whatever you want with the economy. It itself is an expression of a deeper objectivity and necessity and materiality of the economy, right? The economy becomes politicized, but the politics also become economized, right? You have to, so I think that's the kind of distinction we have here. Because on the one hand, you have the Great Reset, which is kind of like a utopian planning of the economy, which does not take into account its own material premises. On the other hand, you have communism, Marxism-Leninism, socialism with Chinese characteristics, in which the planning is already reconciled with its very material premises. And I think that's the fundamental distinction we have to make between these Western bourgeois socialist countries and communism. What I want to say is that as a lesson that I think we should take from this is that we must not make socialism into a dogma. We can't make socialism into a dogma. We have to be dialectical materialists. So on the one hand, we must always stay true to the original contributions of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, right? But we also have to incorporate what the actual historical experience of socialism is, right, in the USSR, and especially in the People's Republic of China. Also, the revolutions in the mode of production that have occurred since their time. The only way we can stay true to these thinkers is precisely through having a proper analysis of the current world that we live in based upon the historical experience that was accumulated after their deaths. That's the only way we can actually stay true to their original contributions. In order to repeat the contributions of someone like Marx or Engels or Lenin, you have to be a revolutionary in a sense, right? You can't just in a dogmatic one-to-one way apply everything they said about their circumstances to your circumstances. So when people say that I'm rejecting Lenin's theory of imperialism, that's something I also want to clarify. I'm not rejecting Lenin's view of imperialism. My position is actually based upon the fact that I take his view of imperialism entirely literal, right? I take it completely directly, in a very direct way. I simply think that Lenin was actually correct, right? Because Lenin in several places describes imperialism as a transition to socialism, right? As a transition to a higher mode of production, right? I'm just taking that literal. I think that he's right. Imperialism is capitalism in decay. It is the transition between capitalism and socialism. And that transition actually has more or less occurred over the last 100 years. So I think that this new analysis is not really all that new, right? I think it's entirely based and consistent with Lenin. I think it's also entirely consistent with Marx, right? I mean, Marx predicted the sublation of capital, right? I think it's 100% consistent. In fact, I think it's the only way to stay consistent to their contributions and to their theories. It's the only way to take them seriously, to take what they said seriously, right? The victory of socialism has occurred. The victory of socialism is objective, not only subjective. The war that we fight today, the struggle that we fight today is in the superstructure, is over the subjective expression of this new mode of production. It's in politics. That's the nature of the struggle we have today. The revolution in the mode of production has already happened. And this way of thinking, too, this non-dogmatic way of thinking, you have to apply it to everything. If you actually want to stay true to the contributions of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, the primary theorists of Marxism-Leninism, you have to have a real dialectical materialist and scientific understanding of all the new phenomena in respect to political economy, in respect to religion, in respect to culture and civilization, right? You have to have this dialectical materialist view. I really don't think that based upon this kind of outdated 1910s, 1920s view of Marxism, right, you can actually understand much about the modern world. You can't even understand the way that socialism with Chinese characteristics works, right? Another view of ours that is considered heretical, right, for example, is the way we talk about civilization states and the return of civilization, right? How the past returns even stronger in the future. But if anything, isn't that the primary significance of socialism with Chinese characteristics? The discovery that socialism must be informed by the historical experience of China, that it must be conformed, as Jiang Xinggan said, by traditional Confucian civilization, right? I think this is a direct implication of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's an advancement in materialism because socialism with Chinese characteristics understands that the material is this kind of unconscious civilizational reality that can't be dictated subjectively, right? So Confucianism, these different kinds of things and so on, they stem from objective civilizational realities. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is simply reconciling with these objective realities, right? So I think really you have to have a modern understanding. That's the main thing I'm getting at. You have to abandon dogma and have a modern scientific understanding of the mode of production. And also, for me, I don't think this disproves anything that Marx and Engels and Lenin wrote. I think this is entirely consistent with them, and that they were correct. I think that this vindicates them even. So yeah, that's my position. And doing. I just kind of wanted to clear this up and explain to people what I've been talking about. Well, all right, there you have it, guys. I hope you have a good day. I'll have more spaces in the future when I think they're necessary. Have a good day, guys.